Our mission at ULI is to provide leadership in the responsible use of land and in creating, sustaining, thriving communities worldwide. And here in St. Louis, we seek to inspire and encourage us to make St. Louis a better, more equitable place to live for people from all walks of life. And we'll talk a lot more about that in the program. So ULI St. Louis and our leadership team has heard from dozens of you that we need a plan. More so when we met last year with our advisory board, we heard loud and clear as we were developing our 3-year strategic plan. We need a plan, we need a plan. And so, of course, now if we fast forward to the current situation and the impact that the pandemic has had, it just seems that if there were ever a time to think big and rethink the status quo and push St. Louis forward and upward together, the time is now. So in response, we've been asking a lot of questions like, we need a plan. Well, what sort of plan? There's all kinds of plans, big plans, little plans, strategic plans, neighborhood plans. You know, what should it look like? Who should really shepherd that plan? Of course, it doesn't operate in a vacuum. It's tied to neighborhood economic development. You do in your job. Most of the people who can hear me are in that market. And its impact is at every scale and touches really every address. So, you know, to answer these questions, we've assembled what we think is a great panel with a variety of thoughts and ideas for us to kick around today. So Amanda Clark, Community Tours Manager for the Missouri Historical Society, is here. Don Rose here, he can tell us, he's the Executive Director of the Planning and Urban Design Agency. He, of course, can tell us sort of where we are and what we have going on. Roshan Austin from Memphis is here. She's the president and CEO of The Works, Inc. So Memphis just completed a large comprehensive plan, and so she can talk about the scale of the region. And then Kevin Wright, principal and director of operations and strategy at Yard & Company, is here to talk about the neighborhood scale and what we can do there. So at our last district council management meeting, Ann Althoff shared what was seemingly a perfectly appropriate and famous quote from Arthur Ashe: "Start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can." And when she mentioned it, we all sort of looked at each other and said, wow, what great advice, especially now. So Ann, can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Would love to. I'll repeat his quote again because it's so powerful, but start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. And it is credited to Arthur Ashe, an American professional tennis player who, if you don't know, won 3 Grand Slam singles titles, was the first African-American player selected to the U.S. Davis Cup, and that's the tennis equivalent to the World by St. Louis and Dwight Davis, and the only African-American ever to win singles titles at Wimbledon, the U.S. Open, and the Australian Open. So start where you are. Ashe moved from his hometown in Richmond, Virginia to St. Louis, where it was thought he would benefit from less racial discrimination and better opportunities to improve his tennis game. He attended Sumner High School and lived in Richmond Heights with his mentor in tennis, Hudlin, who at the time was the most prominent figure in St. Louis Black community. Use what you have. He had a coach that he came for, Hudlin. He coached Arthur at the Armory tennis courts, which was basically a gym floor with lines painted on them and a net separating the sides. And he also came for competition. Ashe said St. Louis was what they call sine qua non in his tennis career, which was an essential condition, a thing that is absolutely necessary. The city's nationally ranked players forced him to expand his skills and adopt an attacking style of play that served him well in his professional tennis. But caution, so we don't think tennis, St. Louis was a bastion of social equity at the time compared to Richmond. There is some conflicting information attributed to him about shared. St. Louis was de facto virtually as segregated as Richmond. St. Louis was the worst 9 months I ever spent. And curiously, in other notes attributed to the same author of these other 2 quotes, in 1974, Ashe offered a much more positive assessment of his St. Louis experience, writing, "I had a great year there, although he only spent 9 months." We have work to do, as we all know, and we have work to do now. Do what you can. That was the last of this quote. Ash often spoke about the importance of education for kids and how tennis can teach young folks broader lessons for life, such as self-sufficiency, hard work, and self-esteem. He was a human rights activist, a philanthropist, a broadcaster, a writer, a businessman, and a celebrity who gained renown as an advocate for sportsmanship, education, racial equity, and the elimination of apartheid in South Africa. He had a life challenge, though. From 1979 on, he dealt with a serious heart condition that led to multiple surgeries. During one surgery, he was unfortunately given a tainted blood transfusion that left him HIV positive. And in 1988, he was diagnosed with AIDS. But to further demonstrate his amazing character, he devoted the last 10 months of his life to AIDS activism. He died in 1993 at the age of only 49, leaving an inspiring legacy of dignity, integrity, and active citizenship. Our hope is that Arthur Ashe's legacy will help guide ULI to be our North Star so that we can start where we are. In my mind, that's getting reacquainted with our assets, our history, our people, our physical assets. Use what we have. Use the assets we have, our history, our people, and our physical assets, and do what we can. Get involved in improving and promoting St. Louis and our region, our history, our people, and our physical assets. That's it. Chip, back to you. I hope that serves as some inspiration for our discussion today.
Yeah, thanks. And what an amazing leader. So our format this morning will have each of our speakers take a couple minutes to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what they're up to and how their experience might benefit and help our St. Louis community. And then Aaron Williams on our management committee, our urban plan superstar, is going to ask some specific questions of our panel, followed by an open up the mic to all of you for any questions you might have. And I know there's chat going on. So we appreciate your patience as we zoom through it. Amanda, thanks for being here. Can you kick us off?
Hi, good morning. As it says in there, I am the Community Tours Manager at the Missouri Historical Society, which is a brand new position that I started in January. I was the former owner and founder of Renegade STL, and we were known for bus tours and walking tours and different programming that got people out into the city, into areas that were less known. And we also had a narrative in all of our tours that connected the city and under different themes and different, just had a lot of fun with it as well. And then in January, I came to the History Museum to create a very similar program that was supposed to kick off in April, and now we will be kicking it off in July, by getting people out, walking around on the streets of St. Louis again, and learning about the history of the area.
Okay. I'm going to take a few more moments than we just did with Amanda, I think. I'm a transplant to St. Louis, came in 1988, intended to be here for 2 years working as a consultant on Lambert Master Plan, but got involved in city neighborhood planning. The mayor hired me away to join city leadership to do neighborhood planning and implementation. I was struck by a dichotomy at the time. Tremendous pride in neighborhoods, regardless of their well-being. I got a great negative picture conveyed to me. It was sort of this sense: with the last person headed west, when you cross Kinker, turn out the lights. Forget about big picture planning. Planning is when you play traffic cop, meaning so much is going on, you direct where, not do planning to inspire as to what and where and for whom. Planning was a hodgepodge in St. Louis, and different agencies focused more on goosing development with dollars than the planning activity. My agency wasn't created until 1999. Planning was a hodgepodge prior to that. So we were created in 1999, and the Planning Commission was reborn and becoming citizen-led, which is important. That worked as it lessened the political gamemanship, because in 2005, we completed the Strategic Land Use Plan, AKA our comprehensive official adopted citywide land use plan, the first since before I was born. Thankfully, we had it as it gave us structure coming out of the 2008 recession. We could, by the purposes of the plan, say yes or no to certain things we aspired. We compete with other regions, keep remembering that fact. Amazon was a case in point. We wouldn't always be a runner-up. Brings me to thoughts about two great planning and implementation efforts of the past. which is Metrolink expansion and the Great Rivers Greenway connecting our region. Without those two plans and implementation, we'd be competitive toast with other regions. Illinois and Missouri are different. The land and properties and density in Illinois is different. We got to think about those places. You can see it on the map. Of course, we know how there is distinction. We had Michael Porter come to town to talk us about business clusters, and that made sense. Business clusters of logistics for our region. That got focused in many ways in Illinois. Yet in St. Louis and on the city side, we do think about place and people, of course, and that's what we're doing now. One of the key things is in my agency is to think of us as the regional place that is the urban place. We're a city of neighborhoods. We identified 79, and our upcoming initiative is to, two things on our plate that are majorly funded by a tax increase is the restudy, tire kick, make sure North-South Metrolink is the most contemporary, popular, productive way to do transportation and connect more of our region, our city, and to do neighborhood planning with dedicated tax funding to do so. So we have some reports that we've done on that. If we change the slide, as we only have coverage of part of the city, we'll be sharing these reports with folks as we develop this program, and some tweaked from what we're doing. Thanks. Look forward to the question.
Good morning. I'm Rashawn Austin from Memphis, Tennessee, and I'm the president of the Works Incorporated, which is a community development corporation working mostly in the South Memphis neighborhood. We develop housing. We're developing a park next door to a multifamily development, operate a grocery store. And I like to say we serve the comprehensive needs of children and families because we also are the sponsor of a charter school. And why am I involved in a conversation about planning in St. Louis? I was very engaged in the planning process over the last 2 years with the city of Memphis. And I like to say that the city of Memphis, which is expansive, over 300 square miles, grew up to be a suburb. And it was time that we grew up to be a city that we were supposed to be in the first place. I was very interested in being a part of the process also because our organization 11 years ago was involved in a very extensive neighborhood level plan, South Memphis Revitalization Action Plan, where the priorities were set by the people. What I've found in development is that our legislative bodies and our city had left behind core neighborhoods. And I consider the core of any city, its heart. And your heart, your body cannot outgrow your heart, or it should not, because the heart can't support that body. And so that's why I'm here to talk about planning, because we were left behind in our neighborhoods, and it's important that we plan for a future that serves all of the citizens of Memphis.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. I want to start by saying that I'm a Missouri native. I grew up in Springfield, Missouri, and my wife is from St. Louis, a lifelong Cardinal fan. So it really is good to be here. And if we didn't live in Cincinnati and could live anywhere else, it would be back home in St. Louis. I just want to start with talking a little bit about who we are at Yard & Company. We are a mixture of urban designers and planners that like to think of ourselves as creative problem solvers around growth. Using the lens of planning and design and real estate strategies to solve problems and help places grow inclusively. And we look at that through the lens of placemaking in place. How can we utilize what you have, to tie back to the Arthur Ashe quote, and use that to be a tool for growth. We formalized this, if you want to go to the next slide, we formalized this through the authorship of the Neighborhood Playbook several years ago, and I'll talk more about that in just a second. But what that led us to begin thinking about related to planning was how it's been done in the past and how we think it should be done in the future. So we usually use this diagram to help people think about the traditional approach to planning, which often looks like getting large groups of people into a gymnasium or a community center, standing over maps, putting dots on maps, thinking about strengths and weaknesses. Most of us have probably done that before. And then oftentimes what happens, we put a lot of sweat equity into that, we pass the plan, and then we stop. And a lot of time goes by, and the plan calls for big, grandiose projects, which are important, like light rail lines or big park projects or streetscapes. But what we've seen is that when that process stops, a lot of time goes by. Maybe 2, 3, 4 years go by, and something comes out of the ground, something gets built. And often the people who participated in the plan either don't remember saying they wanted it, or don't remember participating, or have moved on to another neighborhood or place. And if you advance to the next slide, what we think is important is to not just stop and let the experts go to work after the plan adoption, but think about how to start small, and how you can sort of, during the planning process and right out of it, continue engagement in a way that creates a market, tells a story, builds demand for place. That often leads to the coffee shop or the record store or the restaurant opening in a small building, a low risk amenity that more than ever now, these amenities, walkable amenities, are then driving and becoming a magnet for the larger scale development and investments that happen. In our work, if you want to advance the next slide, Kelly, we've utilized the neighborhood playbook, which is a field guide we wrote in 2016 that kind of helps both developers and community members go through a step-by-step process for how to activate places in their neighborhood with the intention of creating demand for economic development outcomes. And on the next slide, there's some imagery of what that has looked like throughout the country. Everything from painting crosswalks to activating parking lots and alleys to installing 4,000 square feet of bike lanes over a weekend to test the demand for complete streets. We've used it, if you want to just go through the next couple slides here, Kelly. We've used this to activate over a weekend an alley in an innovation district in Erie, Pennsylvania, to test the viability for a building to become a longer term use, to developing 20-year strategies for an innovation district, $100 million projects in Cincinnati. So a couple of thoughts just to end on my slides, and hopefully these kind of come back up in the Q&A, is one is that not all places are created equal. And what I mean by that is that not everybody's at the same starting point. You know, you might have a neighborhood that is growing, people are moving back into, and just across the street, a neighborhood that has seen disinvestment for decades. And so I think as a planning community, we oftentimes say, let's give each neighborhood the same treatment. You know, each neighborhood needs a plan. Each neighborhood needs the same approach. And really, we think that's a flawed concept, that you should take a look at where the place is, where they stand, their history, their story, and build from there. And also, you know, starting small, which is on the next slide. You know, I think there's probably going to be a conversation in Q&A about comp plans versus small area plans, and I'm really interested in contributing to that. But whether or not you need to dream big and do the visionary thinking for the next 2 or 3 decades, there are still ways to start small. And so this image is from a project in Dayton, Ohio, that's 100 acres where they're building a mixed-use development with a new city hall. And it's going to be a 2-decade project. But as you can see in the image, there's a way to start activating that site and thinking about how to bring people there today. And then lastly, fail fast and fail forward. So as you guys start thinking about how to grow St. Louis and plan, you know, failure is fine, especially if you approach it in a way where you don't spend a lot of money. It's one thing to fail by building a $10 million streetscape and it not working, but it's another thing to fail by spending a couple $1,000s over a weekend to just test the viability of an idea. And even if it does fail, you learn something and you can move forward. So I'm really excited to think through some of this with you guys in this Q&A.
So thanks everyone. This is great. We got a lot of range of views and ideas. So Aaron, how about these questions?
All right, thanks, Chip. I'll jump right in. No need for any type of introduction. So we'll start with the history of St. Louis. The St. Louis region has an interesting history of planning and growth. Amanda, can you provide us a brief overview of organized and comprehensive planning in the region? And you can touch on major shifts and major changes in the region, as well as population changes, density changes, and suburban growth.
Yes, brief is a word. To cover all that briefly is quite a challenge, but there are some definite themes and things that we can kind of latch on to tell that story. To give that overview, the city, it grows from, it emerges from a village in the early 19th century. And as it emerges, it has a street grid, commercial areas, residential areas, people living together. There's agricultural areas outside of that. And then throughout the 19th century, we are growing at a fierce pace. We are adding industry, we're adding people from around the world, and the city just kind of explodes out from there. And, as that's happening, people are, they're creating those neighborhoods and those communities that are bound by ethnic and economic, tight boundaries, and they create these little fenced off areas. And that's kind of where that starts. And then in the 1870, something that really solidifies that and complicates matters further for the city is when the city votes, to separate the city and county, create that line. So that happens then. But organized comprehensive planning doesn't really get started until the very early 20th century and the end of the 19th century. And those first efforts are meant to better the city, make it more beautiful, use planning, use design as a way to improve the morals of your citizens. And it has this very lofty goal, but it also makes the city prettier for the World's Fair. Everything leads back to the World's Fair. It starts there. And then that morphs in the next decade into something more modern, when the city of St. Louis actually hires one of the very first professional city planners, Harlan Bartholomew. And he does several plans for the city, several comprehensive plans over the several decades that he's in St. Louis. And he's not just working for the city, he also creates plans for the region. So East St. Louis has a plan, University City has a plan, different areas have been touched by him. And he really shapes the city that we have today, because his planning is based on the idea of zoning. So he looks at the city as a whole and says this should be a residential zone, an industrial zone, and things, and gives them those labels. And the results of that and of those plans that we see now are big land clearance projects that eventually happened, urban renewal, highways. Those are Harlan Bartholomew specials there. And what's woven into that are some explicitly racially motivated zoning, and he is part of that, and he helps further that along. And that zoning, goes in several times. The citizens of St. Louis vote for them even, so it's codified at that time. And that's in the city and the county, different neighborhoods and different areas. Put those zoning ordinances into rule. And then by the mid 20th century, we are firmly divided along those racial lines. And we have real estate and planning practices and things that as in many American cities, it's not special to St. Louis. This is happening around the country, that furthers white flight, suburbanization, of course, complicated here by that city-county divide. And by the 1970s, the city is grappling. There's a report that comes out that says, decline is inevitable at this point. And the city is grappling with that. And then they do something called the Team 4 report. They hire a group called Team 4, who instead of kind of furthers that zoning thing and prioritizes different parts of the city and says, put your money here, but leave this part alone and let the market reach it later. So that kind of brings us up to speed on modern, where we are now.
Thanks for that detailed and quick answer, Amanda. That covers a lot. I mean, it takes us from the founding all the way to the mid 70s, which was right when Don showed up. So perfect timing, right? So because of that, Don, I'm going to go to you next. Given your tenure with St. Louis, what challenges have arisen over the years in your quest to develop a more comprehensive plan? What do you think is the missing part of the puzzle that St. Louis needs to further the planning process? What has worked well for our region? What can we stand up now to support a broader planning effort? And most importantly, how can ULI members assist in moving the needle forward?
A couple things. I'm old, but I'm not so old that I wasn't in high school in the 70s. So I came here in 1989. And as I said and talked about the creation of the Planning and Urban Design Agency in 1999. Prior to that, planning was a hodgepodge across all agencies. That wasn't a good thing it really wasn't a good thing. I want to give a shout out to Mike Jones of the Harmon administration to calling on planning and urban design to be formed into a cabinet level standalone department. I think that's pretty good. Proud that we've done that. I made mention that the Planning Commission was re-established, citizen-led. I think that helps with what we all know is we're a city of 28 wards, but I like to remind ourselves we're a city of 79 neighborhoods. We need to use those assets of the 79 neighborhoods. We need to identify what are the missing pieces, and we need to identify that it's not just place, it's about people. We often get distracted by not putting the two together, recognizing as to where we are differently in different places in the city, and where and what are the challenges for the people that live there and want to work there. One of our challenges is also being careful not just to move the deck chairs, be careful not to pirate off others, to place and people customize, be careful, be sensitive, be listening to places and people. I say that as it does happen in our 62 square miles, but it's also the big regional challenge is to be thinking of us regionally and competing against other regions and also the quality of life that we have here. One of the things that I think we often forget, and I'm a member of a group called the Big City Planning Directors from cities across the country. I'm grandfathered into that. There's exciting dynamic cities, of course, that we know of having economies that are on fire or have been. We got to remember our roots of the quality of our character of our city, our assets that we can build on. And part of that gets to be affordability. Part of that gets to be our people. Part of that gets to be the opportunity to finally face up to and deal with equity and disparity issues and racial issues. I led a gathering of the Big City Planning Directors right after Ferguson. And I began with a quote from Jesse Jackson. There's a Ferguson near you, to all my fellow planning directors. And we got to realize it's not near us, it's part of us, and really move forward with how we think about our assets and what our needs are and try to fulfill them.
Thanks a lot, Don. And I really appreciated that poignant statement about us tending to focus more on place than people. I think St. Louis has a rich and contradictory history in how we haven't focused on people, yet we've siphoned off a lot of gifts that people from St. Louis have given us. And I think this focus on neighborhoods will allow us to capture that, because oftentimes neighborhoods geographically embody the culture of people. So moving to the next question, Kevin, considering St. Louis has always been a city of neighborhoods, and we have played to this strength in our planning history, how can the small neighborhood planning approach work for neighborhoods on the rise, those leveled off, and those on the decline?
That's a great question. And, I think just tying that back to what Don was saying about these really big, heavy problems regionally or citywide that oftentimes we think about in a big way, and we make statements around this is something we value. We want to reduce poverty. We want to reduce racial inequalities. And that's important. It's important to have that on paper, and it's important to say that that's part of who we are, and that's how we want to move forward over the next decade or two. But where the real rubber hits the road is in the neighborhoods. You can't really solve racial inequalities unless you're strategically investing in your Black business districts or your racially diverse neighborhoods. And so I think, in my slides, I touched on this idea of meeting people where they are. Regardless of whether you're a midtown neighborhood that is rising in property values and seeing a lot of retailers open, or a neighborhood that's been underserved for several years, the approach of activating places, rethinking through prototyping your streets or your retail, doing pop-up retail, is a process that works regardless of where you are in the market. In some cases, it helps solve problems that might exist around growth. So in a neighborhood that's fast growing, you might be confronting a parking issue, or you might be confronting a gentrification issue and needing to rethink affordability, and just constantly tinkering with the growth cycle and the problems that might emerge. And in a neighborhood that's been underserved, you're tackling trust issues. And the approach looks a lot different. It looks like, empowering and even paying local ambassadors to do the work. Stepping aside as a planning leader who maybe, has to acknowledge the fact that you're not trusted because you work for the city or you work for some government entity. And so the strategies, the tactics within these places are very different, because I do like the statement around people over place. You have to think about the people and what their fears are and what their concerns are and where they've been as a community. So the tactics can be very different, but the strategy really is the same, which is starting to tinker with economic development initiatives, see what works, see what doesn't. And when you see something working, invest in it and be prepared to invest in it, and then see it kind of snowball and grow from there.
And Aaron, if I may, I just want to jump in for just a second.
Go for it.
The trust issue is paramount in that one of the things is, we got to start where we are. And often when it's city government, you're starting with unrealization of how people in our neighborhoods view us, how much trust we've earned, or how much trust we've just wasted. And so trust is a huge issue as we work across the city. So.
Absolutely. And interesting enough, a lot of these same warnings have always been given to us in the planning processes that we've done in St. Louis. Even Team 4, as much flack as it gets, they caution the city that with the depletion zones, you should still go to the people and build trust before you enact this very harmful practice. But somehow the city tends to still default to place and the natural gifts that we've been given with our geography ever since Pierre Leclerc settled on the hilltop, right? We think that our geography will save us and we can just push the real issues down the road, but they keep coming up, which leads to this tapestry that we have in the city. So Amanda, your passion and profession has taken you into so many of St. Louis's unique, popular, and even lesser known areas, or that tapestry that I speak of. What have you seen as it relates to why or how some areas have thrived and some have not?
Yeah, I didn't mention in my intro is I'm not from St. Louis, and so that passion and love of the city, I've fallen in love with the city. I wasn't raised on the narrative, but when I first came here, I was given rules of where to go and where not to go and why, and found that to be kind of strange to be given that stuff. But as I grew renegade, and what I was seeing is that people both from here, not from here, they were so hungry to see the city and to understand, how does Hyde Park connect to Carondelet? What's a Dutch town, and how do I get here, and what are all these places that I've heard of, and kind of get out of that central corridor. And that central corridor is something, is kind of ushered all of the planning kind of into the middle in so many ways, and people want to see what else is out there. And so as far as like what I see is the areas that have thrived, like Lafayette Square, Soulard, and those places that have had their challenges but have still kind of come out on top. Those places have been able to connect to people's histories. Like they feel relevant, like I'm part of this in some way. And it's those places that people have become disconnected from that history that have not thrived, quite so much. And they're easy to kind of set aside. But in what I get to do and showing people, I get to help people fall in love with the city in a way that is not, political, and then it's not like I just get to do it. It's fun to share St. Louis. People are really hungry to see all of it and to understand all of it and to get engaged in how they can be part of it, be part of what's going on.
Thank you.
That's my feel good answer of getting to help people fall in love with St. Louis.
Well, forgive me for, I guess, adding some cynicism to it here. But in your answer too, I can't help but realize even the power dynamics and what you're saying, where you say that the neighborhoods that have tended to thrive are based in the history that people can connect to across our region. While there are other neighborhoods with just as much history that people cannot connect to. And when we say people, we're mostly talking about those who hold the power in our region. When you're talking about the story of the lion and the hunter, you're talking about the hunter here who gets to tell the story, where the home of the lion just sits and rots away. So it's interesting, and it brings us to that big conversation about equity, right? The St. Louis racial experience has occurred in many ways as parallel universes, often colliding at critical junctures. And our planning processes, our planning history have only magnified those deep inequities. So Roshan, we're not calling you the expert here, but we know you have some experience in Memphis. Based on your experience with the Memphis Comp Plan, how can we take what we learn and approach any sort of planning from a more equitable point?
Perfect point for me, because I'm known for being provocative and just calling things out and just looking at the quote, start where we are. And so just looking at Memphis's history, we had not had a comprehensive plan for nearly 40 years. And when I spoke before our legislative bodies, I always started with, your investment in our city over the last 40 years have said that you support white sprawl and urban flight and disinvestment in areas where people of color reside. And in Memphis, that's mostly African Americans, with a population of over 60% African Americans in our city and almost equal in our county. And so there was a lot of mistrust on the part of the majority of residents because they had experienced urban renewal. They had experienced policies that impacted their neighborhoods negatively, closed schools, destroyed businesses, destroyed families. And so we needed to start where we were and really look at that and be honest about our history as a city and how we were mired in racial issues from, I always say, we always say we're the city of kings, and 1968 was very pivotal for the US with the assassination of King, but it was certainly pivotal for Memphis in its downtown, where he was assassinated at the south end of downtown at the Lorraine Motel. And so after 68, you see the destruction even further of the city of Memphis. We just got stuck in that 68 history, I say, for a while. And so it was important that our planning efforts use certain approaches to get people to buy in, the majority of our citizens, to trust again. And everybody never trusted. We had people, I said, I was a huge advocate. So I served on the advisory board of the planning group. I was a management member of ULI, which was very active in planning because many of the members of ULI had overlapping roles on committees under the planning initiative. And I'm also the director of a neighborhood-based community development corporation with a long history of over 20 years in community development in neighborhoods in Memphis. But still, people mistrusted even me. They protested outside of our LIHTC apartment community. And really, we had to sit down and have conversations with neighborhood leaders, people who were protesting to understand their whys. So it was rooted in something. And so I think that Memphis did a pretty good job. We didn't do a perfect job on addressing equity by not only having an advisory committee of people who were developers, but also asking the neighborhoods what did they want. And so we had neighborhood groups that led those processes, not planners from the city. And we had more than one meeting. We activated space. We, so there are many approaches: meetings, activating space, taking people on bus tours so they could talk about the assets in their own community. We didn't name what those assets were. We also recognized that there had been a lot of neighborhood plans developed over the 40 years that we didn't have a comprehensive plan. And so we kept that in mind, and we said, hey, your neighborhood plan is important. Can it fit within our larger planning effort? And so for me, equity is always top of mind in the work that I do, because people are most important. Our motto of our organization is restore, rebuild, renew. And if anybody wonders where the works come from, it is scriptural from the Christian tradition, from the book of James. But our motto comes from Isaiah, and it talks about restoring, rebuilding, and renewing the ancient ruins. And it's not just about buildings and places, but it's about the people who will reside in those places.
Thank you. Strong answer. And I think that leads right to my next question for Kevin. So what have you learned from your planning work that can translate across these different scales of regional level planning, citywide planning, and neighborhood planning?
Well, I think, on the engagement side, there's clearly a theme emerging here in this conversation around inequities and, I think how we define involvement in the process. Regardless, really, as I mentioned earlier, I think of the type of place you're working in, involvement and engagement shouldn't just be coming to a meeting. Shouldn't just be check the box engagement. First off, we can't go to meetings anymore, at least not right now. But people tend to not like meetings. I bet if we pulled the 101 people on here right now and asked who likes going to meetings, we'd get a pretty low number. And I think historically we've said, hey, we're the experts. Let's have a meeting. Let's hear from people. And then let's write down what we heard. Let's make that a chapter of the plan. Here's what we heard. And then, the other 9 chapters of the plan are the recommendations. And then we go out and we build them. I think the approach should be flipped on its head across regional and small area planning, where our approach, we have what we call the discovery phase, where we explore the neighborhood, we stay in the neighborhood, we meet with people, we eat dinner in the neighborhood, we try to learn about it, and then we listen to people in a variety of ways. We try to meet them where they are, at the bus stop, at the grocery store, and then we immediately pull out 2 or 3 common themes and get to work at building them with the community as part of the engagement process. And then that informs the recommendations in the plan. And we often talk about building movements, not plans. And if through the planning process, you can build a movement around people who feel engaged and feel like they can make a difference. And then when we're gone as a planning consultant or as a planner, they continue that on. They're the builders, they're the implementers. Then you get really powerful outcomes. And you also don't displace the story and the culture of the place, which is often, when we talk about gentrification, we talk about affordable housing. Usually by the time you're talking about a concern around affordable housing, the culture or the story of the place has already moved on. And so at the, in the beginning phases, if you can get people really truly involved in rebuilding their place, and if they're a Latino community or an African-American community, that will yield outcomes around retail and housing that reflect who they are. So I would encourage everybody to kind of think through, that the process of engagement is not just let's meet and talk. It's also not just a chapter in the process. It's continually happening. It's constantly evolving, and it's not something that stops.
So Aaron, I just want to make a quick couple of points. The things that are in the midst of our disruption through the COVID-19, the city, Economic Development Agency, my agency, others are forming and participating in creating an equitable economic development framework for the city. Some careful words there, some nationally known folks that have helped in other cities, Tony Griffin being among them, is helping us put that together. It's in a stage about ready to be unveiled past the folks that have been involved and the stakeholders that have been involved. And it will be a challenge as to how to fit that into our context now with the virus. And the second thing is just a reminder, currently what's going on is also the US Census. And it will be a very important and challenging thing, as we all know, to get an accurate count of who our residents are and where they live. And the census is often a tool to do that, but it's gotten disrupted this year.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna keep you on the spot in the spotlight, Don. So a couple good audience questions have come up, and I'm going to try to piece them together for one answer. So one, just looking at our past again, could you shed any light on how zoning in St. Louis has historically impacted some of our disinvested neighborhoods? And then totally separate from that, but in the same question, how do you think the city and our region can attack these huge barriers between the municipalities in our region to, strengthen regionalism and regional planning? Like, what can we do different to help our neighborhoods and our region as a whole?
Two, all right, 2 for 1. So I'll be brief. Aaron knows me well, I can talk. The zoning is, our zoning is based in principles from the 1950s. We have not done a comprehensive method of rezoning the city. We have done some creative pieces to help improve some regulations in select areas. That's helpful, has kept some bad things from happening and been able to goose some good things in terms of both what our use is in placemaking. But still, it's a pretty fundamental basic zoning code. The good news is the strategic land use plan now has a little bit more inspiration as to what should be and as the guide for the geography of the city, aided by what neighborhood planning will lead to us to make a more customized, appropriate zoning changes in areas of the city. Got to do it. We're way behind. Got to do it. Be more responsive. The second part, remind me again what you really wanted to hear from me on the second part.
Regionalism. How can we ensure that the region works better together in this next wave of planning?
So you did the term better together. I said earlier, we got to be careful about just rearranging the deck chairs. We got to be careful not to be pirating from each other. We got to analyze, know where we are, use what those assets are, and do what we can. If we get too ambitious, we won't know how to do what we can. We won't realize what we can. As we talk about other cities, and I meet often with people from Nashville and people from Louisville, they're now doing and planning for a large geography area. And it includes the urban space, it includes the neighborhoods, and it includes far-flung places along interstate highways. And we really have to think about all of the assets, all of that geography, and be appropriate to doing development for those places. I haven't used the word sprawl yet. I don't, because it gives me the heebie-jeebies when I use it. But really, we got to do a better emphasis on working together as a region.
Thank you. And I think, Kelly, you want to have time for one more question, or should we turn it over to Casey now?
Let's slide one more in there.
Okay. Do you know if anything is currently in the works now to, I guess, encourage more regional planning? Are you in conversation with any other municipalities to see where they're at in the planning process? And how are we looking to streamline those efforts at the moment?
Not as much as I'd like to. I mean, as you may know, I also am very involved in the American Planning Association, and we should be using our members. Planning's humble in the state of Missouri compared to other parts of the country. we should be advocating through our members and through ULI more to be doing this as a collective. Yeah. I get very concerned at the moment as to where we are. I'm a people person. I much rather be, you know, walking up to somebody at a bus stop or as they're entering a cafe and going and sitting down with them at the outdoor chairs and talk about what's going on in our community than doing things by Zoom. And it's going to be really challenging. And I enjoy that people are just throwing ideas as to how we can better engage. But to me, it's not quite the same as being sitting next to somebody. So big challenge.
And I'm going to open this very last question up to any of our panelists. How can we engage people in the process of updating plans in the midst of COVID-19? You know, that one was going to come up. So talking to people at bus stops and at their doors in community settings may be challenging at the time, but you all have a breadth of experience, and I'm sure you've deployed other methods. So I would love to hear what you suggest.
I can start there. We've been in the middle of projects when the pandemic hit, and have had to adjust midstream. We even developed a spatial distancing engagement toolkit, which I'm happy to share, Kelly, if you want to share that out. But it's getting creative around how to connect with people both virtually, and there's been a big push for virtual. And virtual has some merits in the sense that if you record a meeting and leave it up online for a few weeks, people can watch it on their own schedule and engage with it. But then it also leads to inequities around access to the internet and the web. And so most of our approach has been more analog and kind of getting creative with the bus stop and the grocery store conversation. So we've done things like we just designed and built and operate a pop-up drive-in movie theater. So people stay in their cars and they stay spatially distanced. And we're holding a public meeting up on the screen and people can honk their horns and flash their lights to engage with it. And then that's kind of recorded and left up online. We're doing a zoning project in Pittsburgh and created a scavenger hunt. It's similar to Don's comment about zoning. The zoning is so outdated that basically the entire neighborhood is illegal for the zoning. And so it's a scavenger hunt where people can go outside and identify buildings that are illegal and take pictures of them and submit them. And also we developed a front porch kit. You know, the front porch has become this really valuable, or the stoop has become a really valuable semi-public space now. And, you know, a lot of times front porches are set back the 6 feet from the sidewalk. And so we've developed these kits where you can, you know, you can request a kit to be mailed to you, and it has things in the box that's delivered that enables you to have conversations with your neighbors about the future of your community. So I think there's a lot of different ways to get creative on the analog side of things. And I hope that we don't embrace virtual too much, because I think it's just not accessible for everybody.
Yeah. So we too are going old school, and many of the residents out in our neighborhood already don't have access to the internet, and they're older, so they don't even want to use it. They're suspicious of it. And so we've been doing emergency deliveries of food because we do a lot of work around food. And so it's door to door, family to family, no contact, but we are able to talk to them. And it ranges from their experiences with their health or them doing the census. We think we figured out how we're going to do a hybrid model of our farmers market, which starts next week. And so keeping social distancing in mind, and we've always continued to operate our store, although we closed our office in March, mid-March, we still operate a store. And so we made sure we're trying to be safe with our customers, providing them with masks and sanitizing equipment and supplies. And so we also are continuing our porch series, or we're starting our porch series. One of our staff people has done it in the neighborhood where she lives. And so we're engaging them. We bring in local bands, we distance, we don't have a lot of people. We're almost up to the point where we can have maybe 50, but if it's 10, we just spread out at least 6 to 10 feet apart, bring a local band in, and in that way we're able to engage people. I mentioned that we're building a park, and so open space and parks have always been important to us, and we've been activating a park that's owned by the city, which is rather large but unused. And so we have a senior walking group, and so we've stayed in touch with them by calling them and checking on them until we can walk together again. And we're trying to figure out how we spread them apart and walk again, because they are socially isolated, and we want to keep them from being depressed and isolated in their homes. And so we're looking for a lot of different techniques to engage the people who we were already involved with in neighborhoods.
All right. Well, thank you, panelists, for giving us your time. This conversation was very insightful, at least for myself. And I'll turn it over to Casey.
All right. I just got a quick note from our Mistress of Ceremonies that this has been recorded. So if you're joining us late or want to revisit any of it, I'm sure Kelly will be sending out an email with a link. And I am here just to, I'm Casey, by the way. Hi, everyone. For anyone who doesn't know me, on ULI Leadership. And I'm just here to offer a quick wrap of what we heard. And I think when I look back over the conversation, 3 takeaways that also seem to resonate with some folks on the chat box were to start small, which also to me means you could kind of start now. As somebody who works in project finance, I know firsthand how long it takes to put a deal together and actually finally stick a shovel in the ground. So I think the opportunity right now to look around at those kinds of spaces that might not be quite as activated as they were 6 months ago even, and maybe take advantage of a really crummy situation that we all globally find ourselves in, is a really interesting opportunity. I think we also heard loud and clear that people and trust are huge. So let's focus on the people, what people want, and what it means to acknowledge maybe why they don't trust each other or us or whoever we or us or they or we are, and just kind of lean into that conversation about how we can really start to build trust at a greater level across the region. And then also, I think we heard movements over plans. And that resonates with me because that's really gets at the heart of what we've been talking about in our ULI sort of brain trust meetings, where we are really focused on a sort of cultural shift. And what does it mean for us to evolve how we think about planning? What is a plan? Who should make the plan? What does it look like? And how can we ask ourselves those questions now, so that even as we sit in this space of great uncertainty, we don't know what's coming, but we know it's going to be different. If we're more aligned and we're more aware of the best questions to ask, I think we'll be more ready to make better decisions than maybe if we kind of sit and wait for whatever it is to happen to us. We can kind of instead take a more active role in making St. Louis an even better place to live. So with that, I would also tell y'all that this is the first in a series of conversations. It seems like people are really latching on to our Arthur Ashe quote. So thanks again to Ann Altoff for bringing that up, because I think in so many ways it resonates right now. Again, we're all living in this crazy time, and all we can do is start where we are. So in so many ways, you need to sort of look around and realize what you have and figure out what you're going to do with it today. So I applaud everybody for really leaning into that quote too, and helping us start to ask the really great questions about where are we in St. Louis and what do we want tomorrow. So I think that's it for us today. And unless Kelly has anything else, we can also mention that our next conversation in this series will, I think, focus on the Brickline Greenway, which is, to me, one of the best examples recently of collaboration and sort of putting equity at the center of a major planning effort. So that's where we'll stop. And again, thanks so much to the panelists. This is awesome and exactly what we hoped for, I think. So thanks for everyone who joined, and hope everybody has a great day.